¿cómo se dice? Respeto, cortesía a nuestro invitado para incluir, pero tenemos la mejor disposición de que colaboremos todos como un ejercicio intercultural en traducir o ayudar, de manera que eso de ninguna manera debe significar que no hagan sus preguntas en cualquier idioma. So, good afternoon, everybody. I welcome you to this extraordinary colloquium on the broad topic of, I need to wear my glasses, identity and social conflict. In the first place, we thank our sponsors, beginning with MIDE, which is the Center for the Study of Research on Measurement at our university that hosts us. This is the building. And then, of course, the School of Psychology and two other research centers that are our Faculty of Social Sciences hubs, which are the Center for the Study of Social Conflict and Cohesion, COES, and also the Center for Intercultural Research on Intercultural and Indigenous People. I'm sorry about that. And that is the ISIS. And of course, also our policy project on civic development. Well, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers of today. In the first place, Professor Phillip Hammack. Phillip obtained his PhD at the University of Chicago and a master's degree from Loyola University also in Chicago. And he's currently an associate professor and recently a vice chair at the psychology department at the University of California in Santa Cruz. His studies focus on cultural psychology, and he's published widely in social, cultural, and developmental psychology. His research broadly investigates youth identity development in political and cultural context, and he's authored a couple books. One of the main, some that you might know, is Narrative and the Politics of Identity, The Cultural Psychology of Israeli and Palestinian Youth from Oxford University Press. And also, there's one that's going to be coming out soon called Talking Help, Dialogue and the Politics of Difference, also by Oxford. It's coming out this year, right? Yeah. Well, Phil also has been an editor of the forthcoming handbook, the Oxford Handbook of Social Psychology and Social Justice, also from Oxford University Press. And his work with Palestinian and Israeli youth has been funded by the Spencer Foundation, the United States Institute of Peace, and the National Science Foundation. Philip has also received several early career awards from the International Society of Political Psychology, ISPP, and from two divisions of the American Psychological Association, the APA, Society for Psychological Studies of Social Issues, Division 9, and then the Society for the Study of Peace, Conflict, and Violence. The title of Philip's talk today is Identity and the Politics of Human Development, Israeli and Palestinian Youth in Dialogue. So, in that introduction, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Loreto. Can people hear me? Okay. That's okay. Well, first of all, I really want to thank Loreto so much for this wonderful invitation, this wonderful opportunity to come to a country that I've never been to before, Chile. And it may be too dark in here for you to see my forehead, but it's red because I didn't realize how strong the sun is here. And I spent the weekend in Valparaiso, so I learned some cultural information next time. But I also want to apologize for not being able to speak Spanish. And so the presentation is in English. And I think, Loreto, you may have said beforehand, in the limited Spanish, maybe I understand that if people have any questions about translation, or anything, to raise your hand. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And
Do you want to take? I'm sorry. Do you want to take questions as they come up, or would you rather?
I maybe clarifying questions during,
Okay.
and then more longer conversational questions maybe at the end, if that's okay.
Perfect.
Yeah. So. And so thank you very much for everything. Thank you, and apologies on my lack of Spanish. And the other thing I wanted to say, because people always ask me when I talk about this subject, most people are curious about my own identity. And I just want to let you know that I'm neither Jewish nor Arab, with no connections to Israel or Palestine. And in fact, before I started this work, I have to admit I was pretty naive about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I thought it had something to do with religion, but that was about it. I was raised Catholic. I knew that Israel and Palestine were in the Bible, but anyway, that was about it. It's useful, I think, for you to know that and to understand that as I tell you the story of my research discovery process. So just keep that in mind. So let me begin with some images to help contextualize this place where I've been doing work and these people that I've been working with for many years now. These images are from last summer and fall, and you may have seen them here in Chile, but they're images of the current situation of violence in Israel and Palestine, which centers on disputes about access to the Noble Sanctuary, or the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, as it's called. This has provoked a new cycle of violence between Israelis and Palestinians, and awakened collective frustration among Palestinians, young Palestinians in particular, about the inability to develop a fully independent state. And some suggested that this might be the beginning of a third uprising or intifada. But if you follow the conflict at all, you'll know that pretty much every year there's a new set of images. So these are the images from the summer before, in 2014, in which a very brutal war claimed thousands of Palestinian lives in Gaza, and traumatized Israeli society with its indiscriminate rocket fire, as you see here, from the isolated coastal territory. This is the cycle of violence that's characterized the lives of Jews and Arabs in this region since the late 19th century, which is the origins of the conflict, when two rival national groups have competed for exclusive control of this same piece of land. So unfortunately, the Israeli-Palestinian context represents a living laboratory to interrogate the intersection between politics and human development, as young Israelis and Palestinians live in this setting of long-standing, intractable political conflict, and every day in their lives they do experience they're connected to the conflict in some way. So those are some pictures from the last couple of summers, but also these pictures are also from the summer, where they look very different, though, as you'll notice. These pictures were taken in the United States, where hundreds of Israelis and Palestinian teenagers have gathered every summer since the 1993 Oslo Accords in Maine, in the United States, engaging in structured dialogue as well as sports and recreational activities. They are participants in an experiment in peace building and social change. And the theory behind these are the programs that I've studied since 2003, and I'm going to be speaking about today. The theory behind them is simple and intuitive. It comes from basic social psychological theory. The theory is that conflict and injustice endure because of the prejudice that naturally occurs when groups are kept apart. If you bring group members together, particularly at a relatively young age, such as adolescence, they'll humanize one another, they'll break down the stereotypes that maintain the conflict, they'll shatter the myths that legitimize violence, etc. So dialogue is really conceived of as the tool through which we come to humanize the other, to understand and recognize the experiences of those we've been taught to see as enemies. This is the premise of dialogue-based peace education. But does it work? So this is the title of my forthcoming book, Can Talking Help? And there's really two questions that are central to me. The first is, does talking result in long-term sustainable psychological change in individuals? And does talking play a role in social and political change toward peace and justice? These are the kinds of questions. It's wonderful that these programs exist. They seem intuitive. It seems to make sense that we should want to support them. But as an empirical social scientist, I want to know, do they actually affect individuals in the long term in the way that we want? And do they affect society in the long term in the way that we want? These are the key questions. I'm going to talk about two major research projects that I've led over the years. The first is a longitudinal ethnographic study of 45 Israeli and Palestinian youth participants in these programs. In this project, I interviewed youth prior to and several times following their participation in the program. The ethnographic aspect of this project involved living with the youth and their families in Israel and the occupied West Bank, and then conducting participant observation in the actual programs themselves, both of which are located in the United States. So you can kind of get a picture of my travels in Israel and Palestine, and then over to the United States, where I was then, living obviously in the United States full time. And then in the second project, I was actually granted permission to vary, or in experimental terms, to manipulate the paradigm of dialogue in which youth actually participated. And this was my attempt to more critically interrogate the nature of these interventions and examine distinct processes and dynamics that occur in the dialogue. So this was a randomized field experiment of two distinct models of peace education, and I'll talk about those. But I want to take a step back and say something about my research philosophy and also the theoretical framework that I come to these projects with, the larger theoretical framework. For those of you who may be familiar with social psychology, Kurt Lewin is one of our foundational figures, and I wanted to put up this quote because I think it nicely summarizes my research philosophy. He said in 1946 that the research needed for social practice is a type of action research, a comparative research on the conditions and effects of various forms of social action, and research leading to social action. And then this is one of my favorite lines written by anyone in academia: research that produces nothing but books will not suffice. And I would say the same for journal articles as well, of course. So the idea here is really that, yes, we want to be producing knowledge as social scientists, but that knowledge, from my perspective, is better when it involves some kind of actual action on the world. And at UC Santa Cruz, we call this the full cycle model of social psychology. So we are theory-oriented. We're bringing theory into applied settings with some, and hopefully the knowledge we produce has some implications for social action that we ourselves are potentially involved in by disseminating our work and working with existing organizations, as I have. And then, this is an important part of this, is those findings then feed back into theory refinement and development. So we're not orthodox, at least I'm not orthodox about theory. I bring theory into the field, and then I'm open to having to develop and refine that theory as we go along. And you'll see as I present the data why it's valuable to take this kind of approach to this type of work. So in terms of the larger theoretical framework in which I operate, I'm going to put up a kind of conceptual map and just talk through it, but I call it politics, culture, and narrative engagement. The idea here is that, the assumption is that the material, structural, and political realities, such as direct violence, structural violence, and inequality, create conflict-sustaining narratives about history and exclusive legitimacy that are internalized in the course of their development. So this is the relation, the role of the psychological in how we relate to the material world. And that engagement with these particular narratives then motivates forms of activity, social practice, and cultural participation. For example, participation in political violence, or, by contrast, in peace-building activities, that then either reproduces or resists the status quo of a particular material reality. So put more simply, I know there's a lot of terms and ideas in this one slide, the idea is that persons and contexts are mutually constitutive, as we say in cultural psychology, and the engagement with narratives mediates this process. So this is informed by social psychological theory, such as symbolic interactionism, and cultural psychological theory, such as Vygotsky's activity theory. You can see the link here between the social, the psychological through social practice. So I think, again, as I go through the data, you'll see how this theoretical framework kind of informs everything that I do, but I wanted to try to put it up on one slide that hopefully makes sense, and we can come back to it later if you want. So just to return to the big questions, though, the big driving research questions: can talking result in long-term sustainable psychological change in individuals? And does talking play a role in social and political change toward peace and justice? And I want to begin with a few excerpts of some narrative data. I should say that my approach to the qualitative data was to examine the way in which young Israelis and Palestinians engage with narratives of conflict that maintain its endurance. Narratives of exclusive legitimacy, non-recognition of the other, and the use of violence in particular. I wanted to see whether these programs fulfilled their claims to work for peace by instilling a counter-narrative that acknowledges the other and argues against the use of violence as a means to achieve peace and justice. So let's take a look at Ali's narrative. He says, "It makes me happy to see all these Palestinians fighting for their country. Every kind of fighting. Suicide bombings, too. It's like I'm happy and sad because it's the only way we can fight, and I'm happy because I see Palestinians willing to die for their country. It makes me happy because Israel has a problem." This is in response to me asking Ali his views about the conflict. This excerpt reveals his appropriation of a conflict-sustaining narrative about the legitimacy of violence to support the Palestinian cause, a narrative which motivates a particular social practice, participation or support of political violence in his case. Let's take a look at an Israeli, and I'll give you some context about these excerpts in a minute. Roai, a 17-year-old Jewish Israeli, says, "I think that we should solve the problem in a way in which we shouldn't give up on our security. We need to fight about it and send soldiers and do something. That's the way we will do it. There's no other way to do it." So similarly, in this narrative, you can see that Roai is appropriating a conflict-sustaining narrative of the legitimacy of Israeli force in relation to Palestinians. You can see how this cycle of violence will just continue if young people appropriate these narratives. He's justifying this with the rhetoric of existential insecurity that is really central in the Israeli national narrative. And his narrative supports a form of cultural participation, fighting, I would argue, that likely reproduces the material reality of violence. So these two narratives are not uncommon in my data set at all. These are exemplars of the Israeli and Palestinian youth with whom I've worked closely since 2003, and they really reveal the way in which individuals engage with narratives that support ongoing conflict by justifying violence. Now you might say to yourself, well, this doesn't seem all that surprising. I mean, young Israelis and Palestinians are living in a context of war and real existential threat on an individual and collective level. So we probably shouldn't be that surprised by these types of narratives. But the problem is that these narratives were actually collected after these young men had participated in peace-building dialogue. So Ali says, when I asked him to reflect more specifically about the dialogue experience, he says, "After dialogue with Israelis, I just got educated more, and I just saw how Israeli kids are educated and how they're made to believe that they are right and how bad Palestinians are. It gave me the opportunity to represent my people and show them the truth." And Roai says, "I realized their reality is not my reality, and what they think is not what I think. I think that's the effect dialogue had on me. With dialogue, I didn't change my political opinions or anything, but I got more information about what they think." So talking did not challenge the rhetoric of violence for these young men. It provided a forum for representation of voice in the case of Ali, and this was a very common theme in Palestinian narratives, and in the case of Roai, information getting, and this was very common among the Jewish Israeli narratives. These are not the types of outcomes that these programs seek. In fact, the organizers were horrified when I first showed them some of this data. But these are precisely the most common outcomes I found over the 4 years of the longitudinal ethnography. And I'll say more and present more of the data, but I wanted to start there. So after 4 years of that project, and in spite of my initial great optimism, again, you can imagine an outsider to Israel and Palestine, being educated in social psychology. I was super excited to go in and see how we could change the world. So I had to ask myself, first of all, why isn't this working? We have lots of social psychological theory and data and studies suggesting it should work. The second is, okay, if we accept that it's not working, why should we even bother? Should we be supporting, talking at all, what have you? So I'm going to answer these questions as we go through. But what I want to do first is kind of take a little bit of a step back. I want to tell you more about the nature of these programs, their history, the industry that they're a part of, and also what actually happens during these programs a little more specifically or concretely. So let me do that. Okay. So the story basically begins in 1993 for a few reasons. One, this is when the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993. This was an interim agreement between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization that set up a framework for ultimate conflict resolution, including mutual recognition of the existence of each other, and limited self-rule for Palestinians in the occupied territories as they were moving towards independence. And and then the other reason why 1993 is important is because this is exactly the year that Seeds of Peace, one of the programs that I studied, was founded. And this is really the beginning of the flourishing of what I would call the contact industry in Israel and across the globe. To say a little bit more about Seeds of Peace, this is its sort of, what we would say in English, its tagline, its kind of slogan, I guess. Treaties are negotiated by governments, peace is made by people. And this kind of nicely suggests that there's a premise about peace building, that it's not just a matter of formal government decree, you also need to have a shifting collective mentality that is opposed to war and violence. So you need kind of both of these things happening simultaneously. The political top-down process of conflict resolution and peace, and the bottom-up process of changing hearts and minds, we would say in English, changing attitudes, changing beliefs about the other. Now, this is very much rooted in social psychology's traditional contact hypothesis, which was developed in the mid-20th century in the United States to challenge racism in the US. And the idea here is that this comes from Gordon Allport's original hypothesis about conflict, prejudice, and contact, in which he argued that it's the separation of groups that creates outward prejudice, and what I've indicated here as conflict perpetuating behavior. Now, if your intergroup contact can moderate or can interrupt this process of prejudice building, and instead lead to potentially conflict attenuating behavior, or behavior that contributes to the reduction of conflict. So this is the basic hypothesis. And the idea behind this is really social change very much from the bottom up, although Allport and others were developing these ideas at a time when social policy and culture was starting to shift towards more racial equality in the United States. Now, to come back to Israel, this approach, this contact approach, was actually imported to Israel as early as the 1950s. The state was founded in 1948, and they did have a Palestinian minority who were citizens at the time. And so the contact approach was actually imported at that point, but was pretty small and slow to develop. But as it developed and really began to flourish in the 1990s in particular, dialogue programs really became the centerpiece of these. In addition to dialogue, and I note a paper down here by an Israeli colleague that does a nice job of reviewing all the different models, but we also have other approaches, for example, joint project programs, These are things like making films or engaging in sports or music activities. In those, the discussion of the conflict is actually discouraged. And then we also have formal and informal educational programs that seek to teach both historical narratives. So there are some limited places in Israel that attempt to do this. But that's basically the nature of the industry. So what kind of impact has this had? Well, as is common, science kind of lags behind practice. And so these numerous well-intentioned programs were not even studied at all. When I began my work, I was really shocked at the limited amount of research that had been conducted on any of these programs. This was largely undocumented until the 2000s. What they do tend to find is very promising with regard to short-term individual psychological change. So if you do a basic pre- and post-test design, you definitely find a reduction in prejudice attitudes, for example, towards the out-group. But no studies had ever really provided evidence that these kinds of programs mobilized young people for collective action. And there's really no evidence of any link to structural or political change. And so, and in addition, there were no studies that demonstrated a link between participation and actual peace-building behavior. I was surprised to find that. And so, and also the studies of individual psychological change consistently revealed that the change was not sustainable over time. So you'd find a short-term effect and maybe a one-year effect, but with erosion of those effects. And then almost no studies went beyond 1 year, but the ones that did showed just decline, right? And so if you look at this graph is particularly disappointing from my perspective, because if we think of the best measure of conflict endurance as actual deaths, we actually don't see a reduction in deaths as more and more Israelis and Palestinians have participated in programs like Seeds of Peace. This graphs conflict deaths against Seeds of Peace participants. Actually, we've only seen the conflict escalate since the contact industry has flourished. This is obviously not, I'm not suggesting anything causal, this is a correlational claim. But simply put, there's not compelling evidence that these programs influence the conflict in the direction they intend to work for peace. Okay, but let's get to 2003, so that I can say a little bit more specifically. Let's really put the microscope on what's going on in these programs to try to understand why they don't seem to be playing a role. So 2003 is actually when I began this field work. The picture in the top left is my beautiful view from my cabin in the woods of Maine. This could not be more different than what Israeli and Palestinian lives actually look like. These are both of the programs in which I conducted research are basically cultural removal programs. So Seeds of Peace represents what I would argue is an isolated cultural system in the woods of Maine. Hands of Peace, which is the purple t-shirt program, involves the integration of Palestinian and Israeli youth more explicitly into US culture in Chicago. So in that program, the teenagers actually stay with host families in Chicago. But the curricular centerpiece is identical in both of these programs, that dialogue is really the central piece. Facilitators are trained in conflict resolution, mediation, and social psychology, and their goal is to build listening and negotiation skills, as well as to foster a common identity as peacemakers, transcending these polarized national identities with which youth come to the program. And I conducted participant observation in the actual programs themselves. I found these goals are accomplished not just through the dialogue, but also critical rituals and practices. For example, the removal, once young people get to the camps, the removal of all national symbols. I mean, it's actually a very kind of aggressive thing to watch, because the young people get off of buses, and not surprisingly, I mean, they're wearing things like the Star of David necklace, Palestinian keffiyeh, which is this traditional scarf, which these do have nationalist meaning, and they're intentionally wearing, and they're actually removed. These things are actually removed from them as they get off the bus. It's kind of like you're getting to jail and you have to put your belongings in. So that's the way it looked to me. But anyway, young people then are actually, they're not publicly stripped of their clothes, but also like a prison, they are instructed that they have to wear a uniform for the 2 or 3 week duration of the program. And that's why you see all these T-shirts. And the idea, there's a theory behind all of this. The idea is that you wear a common uniform, you're emphasizing a new common identity. And so all these symbols, these material symbols of difference are removed. That is the theory behind all of this. Commonality, commonality, commonality. That's really the key word I want you to be thinking about here. Now the flag raising ritual, which there's a picture of here in the bottom right, is also very important. It really tells you a lot about the philosophy curriculum of the program. The flag raising ritual occurs on the second day of the program. So everyone's in their uniforms, no more Stars of David, no symbols, anything. And what happens is the youth are instructed to gather outside the gates of camp where their national flags fly. You can see that there in the picture. They're then instructed to sing their respective national anthems, and after that are instructed to sing the Seeds of Peace anthem they've learned the previous day. They're told then by the camp director that they enter the camp leaving their national identities outside the gates behind them. They are all now seeds, and this term is used. They are a seed, they are a seed. Here's the Seeds of Peace song, a little piece from my field work. It's actually a very catchy song. I don't have the recording. I should have the recording. But anyway, here's the lyrics. People of peace, rejoice, rejoice, for we have united into one voice. Again, the idea of commonality. A voice of peace and hate of war. United hands have built a bridge between two shores. We on the shores have torn down the wall. We stand hand in hand as we watch the bricks fall. We've learned from the past and fear not what's ahead. I know I'll not walk alone, but with a friend instead. I'm highlighting in green some of the important words here. I am a seed of peace, seed of peace, seed of peace. One voice, commonality, friendship. This is actually considered very central to the contact theory, is that if you develop a friendship, that plays a major psychological role. And I am a seed of peace, this identity reconstruction process that occurs, that's attempting to occur at the program. So the goal here, this model of peace education has come to be known as the coexistence model. And the idea is that peace-building dialogue leads to a sense of commonality among participants, which then allows them to develop a common or superordinate identity and a cosmopolitan set of values or ethics that will then motivate peace-building activity. So again, this sounds great. I mean, it sounds totally intuitive. Sorry, I already told you it doesn't work. But anyway, but I want you to understand the theory, because when I show you the more about the experiment that I did in the second project, we tested a different model. So this is this kind of standard model in practice, the coexistence model. But let's take a look at some more of my data to better understand why this goal doesn't seem to typically be achieved. So Ayelet, a 16-year-old Jewish Israeli, when I interviewed her immediately after dialogue, she said, when I go home, I want to tell everyone about all the Arab friends I made. See, I'm highlighting key thematic words here. And what amazing people they are, and how they're just like us, commonality. There's no difference, really, between Jews and Arabs. Listening to all the stories of the Arabs, it made me realize why they do those things, like bombings. We are all human beings. So participation in the program has reduced her stereotypes of Arabs. She now sees the common humanity of Jews and Arabs and expresses a genuine intent to engage in the type of behavior we would hope to see upon her return home. She wants to share with her friends these experiences. Let's take a look at Layla, a Palestinian citizen of Israel. This is 1 year after dialogue. She says, before I came to the camp, I had a lot of racist ideas. I just hated the Jewish, this hatred, I just couldn't change it. After the camp, I've been changed a lot. Before camp, I really agreed with the suicide bombings, but afterwards, I totally disagreed. And after I had a lot of friends, Jewish friends, I would see the news and I kept thinking, how would that be if a Jewish friend of mine would die in a suicide bombing? How would I respond? You can see the development of kind of empathic cognition here. After being with Israelis, I realized when you understand someone, you can like him. So I've been changed a lot, and I have to say that after becoming a Sikh. So you can see how she really internalized this, this counter-narrative, this common identity as a seed of peace. So I call these particular patterns of identity outcome identity transcendence, because basically what's happening is the young people are sort of transcending their kind of polarized, conflictual national narrative into some larger common humanity narrative. They've internalized this kind of superordinate identity. This is exactly the desired outcome of both programs. So when I presented to the programs, they were very excited about this data. I found that it occurred with some frequency immediately after the program in those interviews. And you can imagine me, especially that first year, being super excited to get that kind of data immediately post-program, and then get sad after that. But anyway, we'll get to that. But so like I said, that this was fairly frequent immediately post-program, but generally did not endure over time. The more common outcome I observed is what I called identity accentuation. So in this instance, we actually find evidence in the data of young people coming to identify more strongly with that polarized, divisive, conflict-sustaining narrative. So let me just show you the narrative of Mohammed. 1 year after dialogue, he said, "I didn't like change or accept the Israelis. I felt more like I realized that I'm the real owner of this land, exclusive legitimacy. I was even more Palestinian. I felt more Palestinian when I came back because I realized they don't really care. When I came back, it made me want to read more about the conflict and about my people, but it also made me realize nothing's going to change. All I can do is stay focused on my life and just be proud to be a Palestinian because you know you're the legitimate owner of this land. I always say a day will come and everything will be like the way it should be from the beginning. We'll have our land back, our country back, and if not, the end of the world will come soon, and people will be judged for what they did." So the narrative of Muhammad really illustrates this identity accentuation process. Contrary to the aims of the programs, dialogue actually gave him the opportunity to become more hardened in his national identity. It activated a sense of pride and stronger claims of exclusive legitimacy than his pre-programmed narrative contained.
Phil, let
Yes.
me ask you a quick,
Sure.
just a quick question. What was the question there? I mean, it was
What was the prompt?
the prompt. I mean, to this.
The 1 year post dialogue. This
Okay.
one was, oh yeah, how did your experience in dialogue affect you?
Okay.
Like, what kind of change did you think it brought in you? And so, sorry about that. Yeah, I should have
That's
included
okay.
that. Yeah. So now let me better illustrate the path from transcendence to accentuation that I found by returning actually to Aylet's narrative, because you remember what she said a few slides ago. Now, in response then to that question, when I got back, she says, I told my friends what all the Palestinians had said. Remember, she said she was going to do this. And they said to me, there's no way it could all be true. Like what they said about the checkpoints and the injustices or stuff that goes on in the West Bank with the army. It's just not true. I think they were just exaggerating it. As much as I want to understand them, I can't give up my country. I can't give up Jerusalem. As much as I don't live there and I don't really go to the wall and everything and don't pray and I'm not that religious, but still it's important for me, for my people. Basically, I feel confusion after the program, but I just focus on my life here and I don't think about the Palestinians. So Aylet describes a process by which she ultimately came to a stronger sense of national identity and exclusive claims of legitimacy. Her position on Jerusalem, for example, which in her pre-program narrative, she argued strongly should be shared. I mean, she was actually one of the most left-leaning, critical of Israeli policy, young people that I worked with initially. So you can imagine this was kind of hard for me too. Interesting, not surprisingly, she was also very hard to track down 1 year later. I mean, it's interesting when people kind of know what they have to say might disappoint you, that they can be hard to contact in a longitudinal study. And let's also take another look at Layla. I want to focus on specific individuals to show you this process. This was actually from an interview collected 2 years after dialogue. And so she says, I've thought a lot about Seeds of Peace and my experience in the situation, and I had this point where I realized the situation and the reality is much harder and stronger than Seeds of Peace. If you think back to that theory slide, the material reality, right, and then the psychological engagement with that. She says, with Seeds, it's like we're in this bubble. I used to try to talk about peace with others to convince them that we can do something, more understanding and all that. I just realized the influence of the reality is much stronger than the influence of Seeds of Peace. Seeds of Peace isn't a reality, it's just words you learned at camp. It's just a narrative that's detached from her material reality. It's going nowhere. I feel depressed and hopeless about it. I couldn't change anything, really, in the situation. So, Layla, this young woman who had previously narrated this story of identity transcendence, now she tells a very different story. She was once very proud to claim this identity as a seed. She now frames Seeds of Peace as just words, a narrative detached from this structural reality of ongoing conflict, oppression, injustice. And she sees herself as helpless in this situation, unable to make a difference, someone who really tried, and unable to play a role in the peace-building process. So now she says, I hate the Jews. I really do. I don't hate my Jewish friends. I don't know. But when I see what the Jews do to the Palestinians, I just really hate them. So she's back to this very emotional response towards Israelis. So, what's wrong with dialogue? What's going on here? I mean, you probably had some of your own kind of critiques in your mind when I was talking a little bit about the nature of these programs and what goes on. I'm just gonna highlight 3 things that I come to argue are problematic about the programs. One is that they're actually modeled on a U.S. folk psychology about identity and youth and adolescence in particular. And I'll put up a quote of another one of my favorite kind of heroes in psychology, Erik Erikson, who really captures this folk psychology very well, right, in 1958 in the United States. He says, in the period between puberty and adulthood, the resources of tradition fuse with new inner resources to create something potentially new, a new person. And with this new person, a new generation, and with that, a new era. So this is, the very exciting perspective. And by the way, this might be applicable to Chile as well. My understanding in thinking about the role of youth in social and political change, this might be relevant. This is a very classic perspective on the role and the cultural power of adolescence. And I would argue, based on spending a lot of time with Israeli and Palestinian adolescents, that there's something very culturally and historically specific about this kind of claim, or this way of thinking about the role of adolescence. If you think about the context in which Erikson was writing in the United States, the 1950s and 60s, this was a time of major cultural upheaval in the US with youth-led social movements, youth-led social protests. This kind of folk psychology privileges social change from the bottom up, driven by the masses. But if we look at Israel and Palestine, we don't see a strong youth protest movement. Actually, the youth are leading a little bit of this kind of third intifada, but not the second intifada at all. It was very much driven by older political leaders. But in general, we don't really see good organized youth social movements. What we see instead, actually, is in young Israelis, as I observed in my field work, young Israelis eagerly awaiting their military service, training on weekends to be accepted into an elite unit, such as the Air Force. The homes in which I spent time, this is what people talked about. In the United States, around that age, people would be talking about, well, what university are you going to apply to? And, what do you want to do with your life? In Israel, the discourse is really around what military unit you're going to be in. And so people really look forward to that, to participating, I would argue, in this process. And so we see young Palestinians, or I saw young Palestinians affiliating with whatever political faction appeared to have the most power at the moment. And I saw this as I saw numerous secular Palestinians flock to Hamas during my field work. And they didn't identify at all with the religious nationalist ideology, but they saw Fatah, the traditional secular PLO party, as being weak and corrupt. And so, I didn't see young people driving any of the social and political processes that were going on. So the second and third, so that's one explanation I would argue, is you sort of have this misapplied cultural model of young people. The second is really, the second and third explanations of these identity outcomes I've witnessed over time can be linked to a misapplied cultural model of peace education, really designed in the United States to address issues of multiculturalism at a time, mid-20th century, mid to late, in which policies were being promoted to support multiculturalism rather than the ethnic hierarchy of another era. But this is not at all what's happening in Israel or Palestine. So this model of peace education, which really seeks to encourage individuals to transcend their micro or subgroup identities, they may be appropriate for a multicultural democracy, but for societies such as Israel and Palestine, which struggle with basic issues of recognition and existential security, the suggestion that identity might be transcended is actually really threatening to young people in the long term. That's why when they go home and they talk to people about this new narrative they have, they experience significant rejection across the board, friends, family. This is not, you can't be internalizing this narrative because we're not even recognized as a state, as a people. So these are the identity accentuation. May not only be an inevitable outcome, I think, for such encounters. It actually, this may be the shocking thing that would surprise you. I came to realize it actually may be a more desirable outcome to get young people to identify more strongly with their social identities, because what's really needed in the Israeli-Palestinian context is recognition and security of the two distinct national groups. So to the extent that they continue to not recognize one another, you can see how maybe it would be good for them to actually become closely aligned with those identities and to realize that the other group also has a very distinct national identity. So these are just a few different explanations, and we can certainly talk about more explanations or ideas. Now, I actually don't think that my research will or should discourage dialogue-based peace education. The industry has way too much momentum and emotional appeal and funding to die. Rather, my path has been to try to link my research to existing peace education practice in such a way as to continue to inform it, to push peace education toward new critical paradigms so the potential of dialogue may be truly achieved, potentially. So let me say a little bit more about that, about the second project that I'm going to briefly introduce. So as I've been reviewing the first project, it was ethnographic and charted individuals over time. The second project was what I would call an experimental ethnography, in which young Israelis and Palestinians were exposed to different paradigms of dialogue facilitation. So let me say a little bit about what those paradigms are. You saw the first one already, the Coexistence Paradigm, which envisions dialogue as creating a sense of commonality among participants that will lead to the indoctrination, I use that word intentionally, the indoctrination of a common or superordinate identity, and the internalization of cosmopolitan values. And hopefully this will motivate participation in peace-building activity. So in this paradigm, as you've seen, the emphasis is on personal acquaintanceship and friendship, so that personal identities rather than social identities are highlighted, and on prejudice reduction. So we've talked a lot about that paradigm. But let me introduce you to a second paradigm, the confrontational paradigm. Now this paradigm was actually developed in Israel, rooted in social psychological theory, not the social psychological theory I've been talking about, but a different theory, social identity theory, that some of you may be familiar with. Social identity theory has a different history. It's developed in the United Kingdom, 1970s primarily by Henry Tajfel and colleagues. And that theory was designed to address issues of majority-minority relations and structural inequality. This particular paradigm, that's the theoretical foundation for this paradigm, encourages people who meet together for dialogue to speak of differences rather than similarities, and to see themselves as group representatives, thereby highlighting social identity rather than individuals. Friendship is actually discouraged in this paradigm. The goal is really to promote awareness of issues of power, identity, and policy rather than to build relationships across groups. So direct confrontation is encouraged to achieve this end. Dialogue is intended to create a sense of distinction among people that can then promote mutual recognition of identities and the internalization of social justice values. You can see the language is very different in these two different models. Social justice values, emphasizing the rights of all groups for equality, access to resources, and fulfillment of their national aspirations. And the theory is that this will lead young people to a different kind of peace-building activity. Social protests against the governments that have not resolved this conflict, who are being stubborn about making concessions, for example. The coexistence paradigm is about friendship, individual change, going home, educating your family, your friends. The confrontational paradigm is about aggressively challenging society and going back and being involved in protests, for example. So how does this translate in the actual dialogue? Like, what is this? I mean, this seems very kind of abstract theoretically. Let me show you just a couple of quick dialogue examples. Here's an excerpt from the coexistence paradigm. Now, what you're going to notice is the main thing that changes is what the facilitators say, and that's important to understand. So Sami, a Palestinian citizen of Israel, says, he's talking about discrimination in Israel. He says, "It hurts me so much to hear you," directed towards a Jewish Israeli, "say that it is okay for you to discriminate against the Arabs in Israel." Yossi had offered, he had legitimized why they need to discriminate against Arabs. Now, the Jewish Israeli facilitator interrupts him and says, "Yossi didn't say that he would personally discriminate against you. Actually, you and he agree on most issues. You have to listen carefully to one another." In the coexistence paradigm, facilitators challenge participants to see one another on an individual rather than group level, and they encourage participants to see their commonalities across national lines. So they actually suppress these kinds of comments, or they try to suppress them. Let's take a look at what happens in the confrontational paradigm. It's extremely different. Very same topic emerged. Rania says, "We suffer so much from discrimination and do not have the equal rights in Israel, and you don't hear it or won't admit it." And here the Jewish Israeli facilitator says, "It sounds like the Palestinians who live in Israel." First of all, this facilitator is immediately highlighting social or group identity rather than individual. She says, "It sounds like the Palestinians who live in Israel feel that their voice is not heard by the majority," using specific words related to majority-minority relations. "And yet it seems as though it is important for the majority not to acknowledge that they have caused this suffering. And even each one of you," directed to Jewish Israelis here, "would seem to be afraid to admit that you are part of this majority." So by contrast, facilitators in this paradigm emphasize participants as group members, and they encourage confrontation regarding issues of injustice and power asymmetry. And you can start to see as you look at these where some programs may have concerns about the nature, like which paradigm to follow in terms of whether they'll be perceived as political themselves, the programs. Because in the confrontational paradigm, they don't shy away from talking about politics, they don't shy away from talking about power inequalities in ways that are not really ideological, they're just rooted in kind of empirical realities. In the study I conducted, we recruited the facilitators, trained in these distinct paradigms, but we gave them the freedom to construct their own agendas. We wanted this to really mirror what would actually happen in the program over the course of 11 dialogue sessions over a 2-week period. These were the topics that they emphasized. Now you can see that there are many that overlap, at least thematically, but it is noteworthy that the coexistence paradigm had dedicated sessions for both personal life stories and a conflict resolution action plan. The confrontational paradigm contained dedicated sessions on national identity and power. In the confrontational paradigm, they're very clear that it's not necessary to come up with some kind of specific conflict resolution plan. It's about instigating or initiating a process of identity development that the young people are going to take back to their societies, continue to grow, and to think about power and inequality and conflict and what they can do. So my goal in this project was to document these distinct processes. These models were being used by different programs, but no one was really documenting the distinct processes that were happening, being activated by them. No one was really looking to see, particularly with the confrontational model, was it actually achieving what it was trying to achieve? So methodologically, I did a number of different things. I collected diary data throughout every day. This is modeled on the experience sampling method some of you may know about, where young people completed these diary entries throughout the day. It contained quantitative self-report measures as well as qualitative entries. We have the dialogue content itself. We have thousands of pages of transcripts that we've been analyzing. And then in terms of dialogue dynamics, this question is about who speaks, for how long, when, what goes on, not just the content in terms of what words are said, but who says what, when, and for how long. So I'll just briefly, I know we don't have that much time left, so I'll just briefly say a few things about findings from this study. What this slide is showing is graphing two different measures from the diary data, suggesting that indeed confrontational dialogue does seem to be activating what I would argue is a deeper process of identity exploration based on the self-report, self-consistency variable. Confrontational dialogue also appears to effectively get group members to see one another as belonging to distinct social categories. This is a differentiation measure we used. So it does seem to be leading towards those processes if you look at that diary data. In terms of content, one of the interesting findings that we found, at least we found that this was very interesting, is that actually across the two different paradigms, the same basic interpretive repertoires of history that reproduce the conflict, the stalemated narratives, occurs. Palestinian claims of victimization are met with Jewish-Israeli claims of justification. And this pattern really held across. All we noticed was that the facilitator interventions were dramatically different, but it didn't seem to affect at all what the young people said in that particular paper we talked about. In terms of dynamics, and again, I'm just highlighting a few things from some papers. Another set of analyses you might be interested in, we asked 6 independent raters who were blind to the nature of the study and also screened for familiarity and bias with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to tell us who they perceived as exerting the most influence in conversations about history. So we told them that individuals high in influence are able to take and keep the floor and to guide the conversation in a particular direction. And what our analysis of those ratings suggested was that a pattern of higher influence collectively among Palestinians in the confrontational condition. And what this shows you here is our calculation of gross speaking time, which is a more objective indicator of dominance, basically, in the conversation. And it also supports this notion that the confrontational paradigm is more empowering for the low status group. Palestinians talk more and are reported by raters to actually have more power in the confrontational model. So the coexistence paradigm seems to kind of reproduce that pattern that we find of Jewish-Israeli dominance in the conversation. So it does appear that the confrontational model is doing what it seems to be doing, or what it intends to be doing. And the question, of course, is whether you agree with those intents. Is that the right kind of dialogue that we want? So what findings from the second project are beginning to suggest, from my perspective, is there is a role for dialogue in contexts of conflict. Dialogue may create trouble, and I think this is actually probably a good thing for the status quo in useful ways. It may upend existing power dynamics and expose group members to counter narratives. It may promote recognition and equality if facilitated in a particular manner that emphasizes these issues. rather than skirts them. And dialogue may motivate action to work for peace and justice more directly, not by continuing to meet with like-minded individuals, but by engaging in peace activism. Now, I didn't actually examine that outcome in this project, but I would like to do that in the future. And importantly, I think this view of dialogue actually better links psychological goals to goals of those in diplomacy, government, and political science who've long advocated for intervention in the structural and political level. I mean, people in those fields used to roll their eyes when I would initially talk about my research, because getting young people together to talk, what good is that? But if you get young people together to talk in a way that's very critical of the actual political reality, it might maybe motivate them to actually work to change that in a more aggressive way, which might be needed, given that the top-down process has completely failed. So this view of dialogue sees individuals as facilitators of this process, participating in activities more likely to achieve larger social change, rather than simply individual psychological change. Here we are, 2016, peace is still elusive. These are scenes from the 2014 Gaza war and somewhat more recently Netanyahu's campaign comments in which he backpedaled on the commitment to a two-state solution to the conflict altogether when he was running for re-election, which he won, his party won. This is the political reality, and people keep talking. And so I think we need to keep studying it and arguing for what approach needs to happen or might be the most beneficial to work for social change. So I'll stop there and, of course, take questions and acknowledge my funders. Thank you very much.
Antes que tenemos un recreo para el café, entonces ofrezco la palabra para las personas que quieran hacer preguntas antes de...
Hola, hi, my name is Sofia Farah. I work in a Palestinian institution, and I really appreciate what you presented as a very interesting approach. And I wanted to ask you just a technical question first, and then a more deep question after. The first is that maybe this difference is not important to many people, but in those programs, did Palestinians from the West Bank or Gaza, from Palestine, participated, or only Palestinians living in this group?
Very good question. Sorry that I didn't clarify that. So participants were Palestinians in Israel and in the occupied West Bank, not in the occupied Gaza Strip. Also occupied East Jerusalem as well were participants. The Gaza Strip at the time was Palestinian participants were not allowed to leave. So, but we were able to get participants from, so for example, Ali, Mohammed, they were Palestinians from the occupied territory, from West Bank. You saw a few of them were within Israel. So it's a good question. Yeah.
I'm sorry. The more deeper question, if you allow me, is do you agree, even with the term of coexistence and the failure in those programs, can it be attributed that, as you mentioned, it's unoccupied, so it's a power difference,
right.
Very important. So if you sit them together in a room, it doesn't
Right.
it doesn't make any difference in the local environment. It's
No.
still unoccupied.
Exactly. You're raising a really valuable, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that was the question. And
Yeah.
also, now that you cleared the question, is there any difference in the narrative from the Palestinian living in Israel and the Palestinian from, Palestinian Israelis and
Yeah.
Palestinian from West Bank?
Excellent question. So, regarding the coexistence, first of all, I think you're exactly right, and that one of the problems with the language within the coexistence model, even the term coexistence itself, is it sort of implies that you kind of have these two equal parties who are having to try to learn to live together or something like that. And so, in my experience, I encountered a lot of criticism of the models from people in Israel, including Jewish Israelis and people in Palestine, to anything even using that rhetoric or that terminology, that the coexistence model. And the critiques of it really have been that And even I observed within the organizations that people would talk about balance, for example, and we need to have exactly this number of this, and we always need to have balanced representation of this and that. And this whole coexistence terminology kind of supported that idea, right? And then as soon as we got into the confrontational paradigm, the assumption explicitly was that there's inequality. And so the whole language changed, and there you would get a much more diverse group of Israelis and Palestinians who were willing to participate. I noticed for that reason. They're like, okay, this is something that we diverse in terms of people who just would not participate in the other programs because they saw it as basically aligning with Israeli more right-wing kind of goals. And just not giving an opportunity to talk about the power asymmetries and differences. Now, with regard to your question about Palestinian citizens of Israel versus Palestinians living in occupied territories, I didn't find anything systematic in terms of their differences, except that Palestinians living in Israel spoke more about discrimination in Israeli society. That was the main theme that they talked about. They were content and wanted to remain part of Israel in terms of like national kind of identity. Whereas the Palestinians in the occupied territories would talk about independence and freedom and all kinds of things related to occupation that were really different. So the content was a little bit different in terms of what they talked about, but in terms of their, most of the thematic coding that I did, there weren't like significant differences or anything. Yeah, more similarities. Yeah.
Just a quick question about. It wasn't surprising in a way what you said about what happened when kids went back and tried to quote unquote educate their friends and family. However, something that I think is interesting is, I don't know if you have any data or information about this, what were the expectations of the families when they were sending their kids to be with people, the Palestinians were going to be with the Israelis and theirs. Were they expecting that they were sort of convince the other and not really, because I mean that part is sort of amazing. Not so much the friends, but I assume that the families had to agree to send their kids, and they knew what the program was about. So
that's a really great question. I systematically asked young people what their motivations were. So there I got very diverse responses, which included some that were like, well, I need to go and represent my perspective, or I need to go change their minds, or I just want to meet the other, or I want a free trip to the United States, right? So I found like a really diverse set of motivations. I didn't assess it systematically in the families. That's a really good question, but it did come up like in a lot of my field notes. I would say that, similarly from what I recall, that it was also just like very diverse. Yeah, some families were very much like, yeah, they need to go so that they can, they can properly represent us, and others were, the families were very diverse in terms of they were not all like, same with the young people, they were not all already on board with peace or something like that. So no, it was pretty diverse, and it would be interesting to kind of know a little bit more systematically about that, though. Yeah, appreciate that.
Any other questions? Hector?
Yeah, I have two questions. One is direct to the topic, and the other is more methodological and to the discipline. To the topic, I'm intrigued on how you treat the link between the material conditions of existence, like the real conflict, and then the psychological processes. Because I think that's a discipline, like social psychology or psychology, we have failed on finding precise mechanisms to track, especially bottom-up processes, like how psychological processes transfer into social issues. And this is clear for me when you see the design of these kind of interventions, in which you take people out of their material existence and then put them. Doesn't matter what is going on, like inside the sessions. Yeah? but still they're kind of removing the conditions.
Right.
But when we read the diagnosis we have, it's like, okay, first we have kind of extreme conditions of conflict that somehow influence the psychological processes, but then we fail to create theories and track the mechanisms that will actually have somehow an impact on this. And the idea that if we have enough seeds in some point we are going to make this is kind of extremely naive to all the psychology we know. No?
Right.
And then how do you see this connection? I see in your theoretical model there is this link, but still for me the mechanisms are still missing. So.
Right, exactly.
And the second question that goes to the methodology, it's really interesting to me to see how you are using experimental research on real lab context with qualitative data. I mean, that's fantastic. How is the scientific community reacting to that?
Great question.
Experimental.
So on the first, I mean, one of the things that I love about narrative as like a general concept, I mean, in my theoretical map, I mean, it's in the psychological box or what have you. But it's part of the material reality as well, these what we call master narratives that are out there about history, about social categories, groups, etc. So to me, that's where I would see a transformation from the bottom up, is if by changing people's internalized narratives, they can then change the existing larger master narratives of what's going on in society. So we can think about it in changes around my other line of work, for example, in gender and sexuality, how through various movements and processes, there's been a whole change in the narrative or rhetoric around gender and sexual identity diversity, whether it's transgender identity or same-sex relations or whatnot in the United States. We've kind of seen that, and so I would argue that the narrative is kind of a nice conceptual way of doing that, of linking that. So you can look at media narratives or educational narratives. If we can change the textbooks in Israel and Palestine, that's a very material, concrete thing that could be changed. The policy, etc. I mean, Seeds of Peace, their idea is that those seeds will go into government, maybe. I mean, that's the hope, right? And then they can change policy. So, I mean, I think it really, that's where I think language and social policy and narrative kind of all come together. At least that's how I've been thinking about it and why I like narrative so much, because for me, narrative, it's also why I prefer the term narrative to collective memory, for example. To me, a narrative is a thing. It exists. It's a material reality. It's either, I write it and then I construct it and it's there, or the media writes it, or the textbook writes it, but it's something you can look at and see. So anyway, there's that. Okay, and then in terms of the method, I would say it really depends on my audience. Some places, I was talking with Patricio and Loreto about a talk I gave at Stanford, where, I mean, I think the graduate students were thrilled. They were like, oh my God, this is so exciting. But the faculty were a little bit more anxious, because, well, this isn't really what social psychology does, right? People get into these kind of disciplinary debates about, what their unique contribution is. And I was really trained to think about research problems and questions and just mobilize whatever methods you need to address them. And so, so to me, that's the exciting way to address a question. And I think for me, even though some people look at me like I have 2 or 3 heads, and I kind of do because I'm an interdisciplinary social scientist, but I think it's been rewarding for me because of the kind of comment that you just made, which is like, this is actually exciting. Like, people are kind of appreciate that there's something new and different going on. So yeah, I tend to go out for a beer with the people who get excited versus
Okay,
the ones
so there you are.
versus the ones who are kind of like, yeah. So,
Can I quickly follow up on Hector's first question? One of the findings that really struck me is the salience of the accentuation of identity narratives, and in that sense, you brought up a quote from Erickson in terms of how his theory also assumes sort of an intergenerational order, right? That, as you said, it was in this, when it's intractable political conflict, those relationships between generations might be altered. So if you think back of identity theory, what do you learn? You can see, of course, you could think of identity as a big resource, human resource, right? Very plastic, like a zone of proximal development.
Right.
but at the same time, the legacy of the historical loyalties seem to, and do you,
Yeah.
in terms of building theory of identity, that would be really sensitive to cultural and historical times, not only the personal ones.
Exactly. That's why I have this thing I put there is like identity as burden or benefit. So it's like on the one hand, it's very psychologically beneficial actually for young people to appropriate this identity that provides a sense of pride and security and feel like part of a group and whatnot. On the other hand, it's really kind of a burden because of the intergenerational thing you mentioned, which is like, but these adults are saying like, don't do that because don't give up on our cause. We don't, we're not even recognized yet as a legitimate group. So there's a real kind of burden that young people experience, like, okay, I have to appropriate this larger cultural narrative because otherwise, I'll be seen as a traitor or my group may die anyway. So I think it's, because, Erickson was writing about identity again in this very specific moment, I feel like, where he had all this kind of optimism about young people's ability to just like change the whole cultural system through their identity development process.
And that adults would let them.
And adults would let them,
okay, right.
And then the culture supported that, and it was safe and secure, and you could experiment. But I would argue it's really not safe for young people to do that in ways that...
Jorge, yo creo que tomamos, hay otras preguntas para hacer el, ok, tú tienes otra más y vamos al break porque además tenemos una segunda parte a cargo de otro de nuestros invitados.
Well, I would just make a quick question. Well, have you any experience in studying any official dialogue or talks? This is a question coming from, I was invited 15 years ago to help here in an official dialogue on human rights. And that was the first experience in which we had in the same table people coming from both sides of our political conflict. And many of the things you have mentioned, because I was part of the situation, so I do not have enough distance to see it completely from outside, like a social psychologist, I should say. But my question is whether you have studied any of, because the processes are similar, except that in this case there is like an official ending of the process with some political and legal consequences.
Exactly. No, unfortunately I haven't yet. All I've done is study these kinds of dialogue with young people. I think they're probably afraid to ask me to be involved in those things. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, just in the sense of what I might learn. But no, unfortunately, the work that has tried to look at that, I feel like a lot of times they're not able to actually release the actual transcripts for various reasons. It's hard to actually study it because people are not willing to. But I think it would be really important and valuable. And there does continue to be what we call track 2 diplomacy going on in some ways between Israeli and Palestinian leaders. And I mean, this is really what, if you're familiar with the work of Herb Kelman at Harvard, I mean, for decades, really tried to be involved in that process and do these what he called problem-solving workshops with people. And he and others who participated in that actually did go on to become political leaders. So I mean, I think there is some promise in that. But anything that links, directly to like changing the political or structural, reality. I mean, I had, as an aside, I had dinner last night with an acquaintance, and we were talking about this, and he said, "Oh, it's just too complex. It's too complex. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is too complex." And I said, "Actually, it's not that complex. It's pretty simple. It's just that the political leaders won't agree to the basic, concessions that are needed." So I came to realize it's not really that complex, and it's not about religion, as you may or may not have been able to figure out from this talk. Anyway.
¿Alguien tiene una pregunta? Any other questions? Okay, so thank you very much. So,